Hey everybody, this is Aaron from ASMR Destiny, and I'm back once again with another episode of what I like to call ASMR on the couch. These videos I shoot in my living room, and I am not taking out any of the background noise for this one. So for this episode, I'm going to talk a little bit about some retro gaming controllers. So the first one is going to be, see if you can recognize it. Of course, it's from Sega, but this is from the Sega Master System. This was, if you're not familiar with it, it was Sega's answer to the Nintendo, and so it was the original Nintendo, the Sega Master System, and the TurboGrafx, which were out in the market. And of course, the original Nintendo was the bestseller, but I was never really, for some reason, never focused on what was mainstream. I always liked the alternatives in terms of video game consoles. So I really liked the Master System and the TurboGrafx. And in fact, I mean, I did have a Nintendo, but I probably only had just a few games. But for the Master System and the TurboGrafx, I had way more. But yeah, the Master System, of course, just like the original Nintendo controller, this one just has a D-pad, an 8-way D-pad, and 2 buttons on it. Pretty simple. Like, start was button 1 on this, and yeah, just pretty much your standard rectangular design, right? Nothing even close to what we see today. But you know, back then, you know, no one really cared, and it worked just fine. I remember playing, probably the game I played the longest with this was Double Dragon, and I remember playing that 2-player with my sister, so that was always lots of fun. And yeah, this controller kind of brings back those memories. Oh, the connector is, I guess this is a 9. Well, it's a 9. You can see that 9-pin connector, but looks like a couple of the holes don't have anything in them. I don't know. And speaking of TurboGrafx, here is the Turbo Dual controller. And originally, when the TurboGrafx came out, it had, one of the features was that it had these turbo switches built in. There you go. So you can change the automatic firing or turbo switches 3 different speeds, and that was I guess the exclusive feature that the TurboGrafx console had, was that those turbo switches. So basically everything else is pretty much the same, right? You have your 1 and 2 button, which they indicated by Roman numerals. That was my cat, sorry. They indicated by Roman numerals, and then 8-way D-pad. The select and run button, also a staple of TurboGrafx and all of their consoles. So then this is the connector. The original TurboGrafx used a lot larger connector, but this is the smaller size, kind of like a PS2 connector. And when I say PS2, I don't mean the PlayStation 2, I mean the PS2 connectors for computers that they used to have. That's how you used to connect like peripherals. Like, I'm not sure if keyboards use PS2. I think keyboards use PS2 and mice use PS2 connectors. So it's a similar one. And this is one of my favorite consoles, the Neo Geo. So, of course, back originally when the Neo Geo came out, only the rich people could afford it, because the console was, I think it was like $700 when it came out, because it literally brought home the arcade experience. The arcades, Neo Geo was really hot in the arcades, and they literally brought a console to the home market, and it was the same hardware. Even the games were the same, right? So it was literally the first time that you had the same home arcade experience as you did in the arcade, and no other console could actually say that. And so, but you did pay for it. So like, the console was, I think it was at least $700 or $600 when it first came out, and each game was like $100 or $200. I mean, it was way more than a regular game. After they brought out the home version of the Neo Geo, they brought out the Neo Geo CD, which was their CD version of their cartridge console. And that allowed them to not only bring out the games for cheaper, because people could now afford the games on CD because they were down to normal prices. They also redid a lot of the games with CD quality music, and so some people may or may not like that, but it did have that added benefit. The downside was that the load times on CD were horrendous, because they only used, I believe it was like a one speed CD drive, so the load times in the games were crazy. They were at least like 30 seconds, 45 seconds, a minute just for loading. So, but anyways, the Neo Geo controller, this one is really well constructed. Buttons, feel really nice. And then, but the gem in this one is the D-pad. So it's a clicky D-pad. And it really provided you with really great control, especially because on the Neo Geo there's like a ton of fighting games. So yeah, you need that definitive feel in your directions, and that's what this D-pad gave you. So So around the same time period, CD-based consoles were becoming all the rage. So Neo Geo came out with their Neo Geo CD, TurboGrafx came out with the Turbo Dual, Sega came out with the Sega CD, but there was some other companies that wanted in on the game to create like interactive multimedia, right? And Panasonic decided they're going to get into the game with the Panasonic 3DO. So this is their controller for the Panasonic 3DO console. It was another one of those which were like, I remember when it first came out, again, it was like $700, right? Because it was a 32-bit console, so it was one of the first 32-bit consoles on the market. And because it had this power and, it was a CD-based console, and they had pretty high production values for their games because they had a lot of full motion video in their games and actors and all that stuff. So this was like the first time that you really saw this kind of production in games. And so their controller added a few innovations, right? So they had, I'm not saying that Panasonic invented these, but they have like shoulder triggers. I know that the Super Nintendo had shoulder triggers, but yeah, this one has shoulder triggers. It even has this like crazy port on the top, and I believe that was to connect a second controller. Yeah, so that was to connect a second controller into the first controller so that you can play multiplayer games. So that was because the 3DO, I think it only had one controller port. I may be mistaken, but I think it only had one controller port, so you had to plug in your second controller into this first one to play multiplayer. Play and pause, stop button, this is your D-pad. Added a third button on this one. And what's really cool is that it had a headphone jack on the bottom with the volume control. So this wasn't a cheap controller. They had a lot of stuff going on in this. Eventually, 3DO had some really awesome games on it. I think it's just because the console was priced way out of the mass market price range. $700, no one was going to pay that. So if the console would have been half the price, maybe it would have stood a chance. But initially they had some great games, and then it just petered out. So sorry about this one. This one's kind of dirty, but this one is the Atari Jaguar controller. And I was really excited for the Atari Jaguar because they were touting it as the first 64-bit console. And it had a lot of potential, and it was supposed to be like Atari's comeback console after releasing the 2600 and then losing all their market share because of the crash, the video game crash back in the day. And then Nintendo pretty much took over after that. So this was supposed to be like Atari's big comeback console, and it was a cartridge-based console. But they had this crazy controller where it had your standard D-pad, 3 action buttons and start and pause buttons, but it had this this number pad on the bottom, which I thought was pretty interesting. And this number pad, actually, games would include an overlay that you could stick in here, and then you could do extra actions with that, which I thought added a PC style element to console gaming. And I really liked it. I didn't really, I thought that was a great thing to have, even though it makes the controller big. I mean, it's not heavy, and yeah, I mean, something that gives you added control like that. I mean, that was, I thought that was pretty innovative. Unfortunately, just a ton of things went wrong with Atari. They, I can't even remember exactly what they were, but I'm sure they like ran out of money. They didn't have a lot of third-party support. The games were expensive. I remember having to buy my games, and they were $70, I think. 75. I mean, they were just way overpriced. They brought out a CD console attachment later that had it on top of the original console. But again, without third-party support and the games being brought out and proper marketing and all that stuff, I mean, you're not going to last long. So the last controller I'm going to talk about is one of my favorite consoles, and it's the Sega Dreamcast. The Sega Dreamcast was really a console. It's one of those consoles which kind of like nobody was expecting. Kind of like the Wii, right? The original Wii. Nobody knew what Nintendo was going to make. And then they brought out the Wii, and it kind of like blew away everybody. The Dreamcast, I felt, it's kind of the same vein as the Wii, where it kind of, everybody was kind of expecting this black console, and like the whole like Sega hardcore attitude, right? Being edgy and being competitive with different people and attacking, like, because they had a lot of attack ads with Nintendo back in the day, and just being this like, this is the console for like people who more hardcore, right? More mature, right? And then they brought out the Dreamcast, which totally flipped that attitude on its head, right? The Dreamcast was no longer this like console with an attitude, right? It was more of a softer, literally more Japanese like console, right? More of a Japanese like culture console rather than like an American console, right? And so that's why like the console was all white. It has these like softer features on it, more colorful, obviously. But yeah, they added an analog stick to it, which really added a lot to games, because before they had a D-pad, right, and limited by D-pad, but now adding the analog stick, you could have more granular control in your games. But the real innovation was that you had this standalone device. This was called the VMU, Virtual Memory Unit. I think that's what they called it. And yeah, it had its own D-pad and action buttons on there, and a little screen on it. And literally, you could play games on this, but it was also your memory for your Dreamcast. And you could even connect two VMUs together, and you could like trade stuff. Like they had a Tamagotchi type of game on here where you could grow your character as you're away from your game, and then stick it back into the Dreamcast, and then you could load it on your game. I mean, it was really cool. And you can actually stick 2 VMUs in the controller. And yeah, it was just a really innovative controller, and just something extra that developers could explore and try to make use of in the game. So yeah. Well, I hope you liked this ASMR on the couch of me talking about game console controllers. And yeah, if you have any questions or comments, please let me know in the comments below. And as always, I want to wish you a good night, sweet dreams, and sleep well.